The Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and it is indeed an honour and a responsibility, in fact, to speak on this piece of legislation. I have to say it's with some concern that I see we are supporting the bill. I guess half a loaf is better than none. But I do refer back...
Disagree.
I do refer back because I was just up on the Kapiti Coast today talking about the Pike River tragedy and did a little bit of homework and referred back to notes 1992 Health and Safety Legislation Bill, you see. It was a proposal by the then National Government to step in and provide a new regime that would give better security and health and safety. Well, I do draw some parallels with this piece of legislation because the government is pretending, once again, to come in with the new regime of accountability and accounting for what is a growing level of overseas ownership of New Zealand homes and farmland, in fact, as well, Mr Speaker. We can't lose sight of the fact that it was Labor, in fact, and we're very proud of it, who stood up for the right to a home for each and every New Zealander back in the 1930s. And while a lot of time has passed and there will be many, many hours of debate, millions of hours, I guess, in this Parliament, we're back to now in a situation in 2015 where the Labor Party has to battle for the right to protect New Zealanders' access to a home, Mr Speaker. And this government would have sat on its hands and done absolutely nothing if it wasn't for my colleague, Mr Twyford, being prepared to take it on the chin and expose the growing reality of investment levels into the Auckland housing market in particular, but the flow-on effect right throughout the country. Mr Speaker, the government hastily kind of rushed around like chooks with their heads chopped off, trying to work on a way of coming up with a piece of legislation that might look okay, might do something, but not offend any of its mates who were happy to come and invest their millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars actually, into the New Zealand real estate market. Mr Speaker, the drivers of that investment are still here. That is, there is no capital gains tax in this country. No capital gains tax. And until that's resolved, there will be ongoing interest in investing in our country, Mr Speaker. That must be put on the table. Until we know accurately who owns the houses now, who's trading the houses, and who's interested, again, we will be in the dark and leave the door open for opportunistic investors who have the option in Europe. If you want to deposit your money in the Central Bank of Europe, you will be paying that bank for the privilege of looking after and securing your money, paying them a fee, not receiving interest, but paying them a fee. If you go elsewhere around the world, you will see zero or very, very low rates of interest. So for anyone with some capital looking for a place to park it, New Zealand's a very positive proposition. It has no capital gains tax. It's got interest rates that drive up house prices across the board so that people can afford to pay back their loans, Mr Speaker, on the basis of a capital gain. And this merry-go-round that is driving up the price of houses in Auckland at an unrealistic and ridiculous rate. But what we've got is a situation here that will not in any way be subdued by this token piece of legislation. But what does the opposition have as an alternative? Well, we don't at the moment. We've put up some very good ideas to the government, have been rejected. We've put up good ideas and will do so in the committee stages of this piece of legislation, no doubt. But for the moment, the best that we can do is support this piece of legislation, but point out the flaws in it and hope that the government's prepared to make the proper amendments in the committee stages to give it some real teeth. Because at the moment, Mr Speaker, it doesn't have the proper teeth. Mr Speaker, the confusion over things like offshore or active overseas investors is a bit beyond belief, Mr. Speaker. These things should be very clear. We welcome migrants. In fact, we're now welcoming refugees, and I welcome that. More refugees today. We welcome these people into the country. So people coming in who want to reside and commit to New Zealand, we want to provide them with an opportunity to buy a house at an affordable rate. But if you want to park your backside in Zurich, or in Berlin, or in London, or Chicago, or Shanghai, then we say, we don't really want you. We don't want you inflating our market to the point where New Zealanders can neither buy nor afford to rent homes. That social dislocation and the uncertainty caused by that has huge flow-on effects. And while the members of the National Party will jump up and down about the cost of social welfare and the cost of special education and what they're having to do through so-called charter schools and the rest, Mr. Speaker, all of these things can be improved, can be assisted by providing people with a home, with access to a house that they can then turn into a home. Mr. Speaker, when we've got legislation that doesn't even define accurately a main home, that doesn't even clarify exactly whether a person's offshore or onshore, or whether they're a Kiwi or not, I say to you that the register they're going to form here won't be worth the paper that it's written on. Mr. Speaker, we need decent legislation in this area. There's no doubt about that. We need homes as much as we did in the 1930s, Mr. Speaker. I say that everyone in New Zealand should read carefully the minority report of the Labour opposition on this bill, pointing out that we do support it at this stage, but we point to the flaws in it. Mr. Speaker, we believe that all parties, anyone involved in a residential property transaction, because after all, you've got to pay the lawyer, you've got to go and check your limb with the local council, you've got to go through all this rigmarole to buy a house. So why shouldn't anyone else, Mr. Speaker, have to meet the same requirements? An IOD number, if there's an overseas tax number, that should provide information as part of the transaction as well. That is, that people be identified by who they are, where they live. They don't necessarily have to state what they bought the property for. That may become evident, Mr. Speaker, because if they live in Zurich as their main home, it's unlikely they'll be buying a property here in New Zealand for their main home also. That would then deem the person to be an investor, Mr. Speaker, and I guess would add weight to the view that Labour has that the doors are too open. And access into the New Zealand property market that has been encouraged by the national government because it doesn't care where money comes from. It just wants to see money. Because under the current structure that they have this economy, the money flows to the people at the top and makes it harder for those people at the bottom. That kind of Tory philosophy is part and parcel of every piece of legislation that they pass in this House. Let's not forget that. And this piece of legislation does nothing to stop that flow and the division that is occurring in this country between those people who have the capital, who can invest in rental properties, assisted by overseas investors who then come in and pay a bit more and give them a bit of profit and allow them to go, and so the merry-go-round continues. But what about the young Kiwi family? What about these refugee families that John Key's going to let into the country? What chance will they have of buying a house and turning it into a home if the government continues to have an open door policy to foreign investors? This piece of legislation is tokenism. It is tokenism to try and get New Zealanders who are struggling to buy a home to believe that the government really does care. That member down there was calling for more land in Nelson. Ridiculous statement he made on the front page of the paper down there. Made a fool of himself. Mr. Speaker, the government is making statement after statement that are wrong, they're misleading in this whole area of home ownership and security for New Zealanders. This piece of legislation will be exposed for what it is, but the opposition must support it as one small step in the direction that we need to go, that is accurately identifying who's buying houses, what they're buying houses for, and what it's doing to prevent New Zealanders having their own homes.
Tim McIntyre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank members who have spoken